The silence was a physical weight, a shroud woven from the collective gasp of the entire human nobility, pressing down on Ilara's shoulders until she thought her bones would crack. Her wedding gown, once a symbol of hope and duty, now felt like a burial dress, its pristine white a mockery of her sullied future. Lord Valerius was gone, his absence a gaping wound in the heart of the grand cathedral, and in his place stood only shame. Every pair of eyes, pitying, scornful, triumphant, was fixed upon her, the girl whose only value had just been declared worthless. She was a ghost at her own wedding, an offering rejected at the altar of politics. In that crushing stillness, where her world ended, it felt like the entire realm was a witness. I wonder, as you watch my story unfold, where are you? Tell me your name, where you're watching from, and what time it is in your corner of the world. Subscribe and bear witness to the fate of a fallen daughter. The whispers began as a low hiss, slithering through the pews and wrapping around the cold marble columns like venomous vines. They spoke of House Vance's ruin, of her father's foolish ambition, and of her, the plain, undesirable bride left to wither in the public eye. Her father's face, visible from the corner of her eye, was a storm of impotent rage and crushing despair. He had gambled everything on this union, and now the debt had come due in the form of his daughter's humiliation. Ilara's past was a litany of rejections, a constant reminder that she was a tool, a means to an end, but this public severing was a wound from which she knew she could never recover. She was trapped, not by stone walls, but by the weight of her family's failure and her own secret, shameful desire for a life where her worth wasn't measured by the man who would or would not take her hand. From the shadowed alcove of the upper gallery, a place mortals dared not tread, Kalen watched the pathetic human drama unfold. He felt nothing of their fleeting emotions, the shame, the anger, the schadenfreude. Instead, his ancient senses were attuned to something far more profound, a faint, almost imperceptible thrum of old-world magic emanating from the abandoned bride. It was a dormant power, a forgotten lineage singing a quiet song only he could hear. This was the key, the anchor he so desperately needed to halt the withering that was slowly poisoning his people, turning their immortal grace into primal rage. His court was a nest of vipers, each waiting for a sign of weakness to strike. He was a king walking a knife's edge, his vulnerability a secret guarded more fiercely than his own life, and in this humiliated mortal girl he saw not a broken toy, but the last, desperate hope for the survival of his entire race. A collective shudder rippled through the cathedral as he descended. The air grew sharp and cold, the scent of ancient forests and winter frost displacing the cloying smell of incense and fear. Kalen moved with an ethereal grace that was both beautiful and terrifying, his silver hair a river of moonlight against the dark, imposing silhouette of his ceremonial armor. The whispers died in the throats of the nobles, replaced by a stark, primal terror as the High King of the Elves, a figure of myth and nightmare, strode into their midst. He ignored the trembling lords and their pale-faced ladies, his gaze fixed solely on the girl at the altar. Every step he took was a deliberate shattering of tradition, clear and undeniable intrusion into the mortal realm. He was a living storm, a force of nature walking toward a single, trembling flame, and the world held its breath to see if he would extinguish it or claim it. He stopped before her, a towering figure of impossible beauty and chilling power. Ilara had to crane her neck to meet his gaze, and what she saw there was not pity, but an unnerving, possessive intensity that seemed to strip her bare, seeing past her shame to the very marrow of her bones. He was so close she could feel the cold radiating from him, a stark contrast to the flush of humiliation burning her skin. The entire world had shrunk to the space between them, a fragile bubble of silence in a sea of shock. He leaned in, his voice a low, resonant whisper that cut through the cathedral's stunned silence, meant for her ears alone, yet heard by all. "You're with me now." The words were not a request or a comfort. They were a declaration, a binding of fate that sealed her. Escape from one cage only to thrust her into another, far more gilded and infinitely more dangerous. Ilara's past was a tapestry woven with threads of duty and disappointment, each strand pulled taut by her father's desperate ambition. From her earliest memories, she was never just a daughter. She was a political asset, a piece on a board in a game she didn't understand. Her lessons were not in art or music, but in lineage, alliances, and the subtle art of being agreeably silent. Her value was calculated in acres of land and barrels of grain her marriage could secure. Her mother, a woman worn down by her husband's relentless scheming, offered no comfort, only lessons in resignation. This upbringing hollowed out a space inside Ilara where a child's dreams should have been, filling it instead with the cold, heavy certainty that her only purpose was to be a sacrifice for a house that saw her not as its heart, but as its last, desperate gambit for survival. The wound of rejection had been inflicted long before Lord Valerius left her standing alone. It was a scar layered over countless smaller cuts from her youth. There was the visiting duke's son who had laughed at her plain brown hair, comparing it to a sparrow's nest, and the count who had openly assessed her as if she were livestock, declaring her dowry insufficient for her lack of remarkable beauty. Each dismissal, each critical glance, had been a chisel, chipping away at any notion of intrinsic worth. She learned to armor herself with quiet obedience, believing that if she was dutiful enough, compliant enough, she might finally be deemed acceptable. Valerius's public abandonment was not a new wound, but the final brutal tearing open of all the old ones, proving the one truth she had always secretly feared. She was, and always would be, fundamentally unwanted. Because of this, she never dared to dream of romance. Love, in the stories she secretly read, was a wild, untamable fire, a force that belonged to beautiful, cherished heroines, not to dutiful, plain-faced pawns like her. Her most audacious hidden desire was far simpler, and to her far more impossible, a single day of anonymity. She longed for the freedom to walk through a market without being the Vance girl, to sit under a tree with a book without calculating the political implications of being seen, to breathe air that wasn't thick with the weight of expectation. Romance was a language from a foreign land she would never visit. Her only hope had been to perform her duty so perfectly that her husband might grant her a quiet, peaceful corner of his castle, a small cage where she could at least be forgotten. Kaelin's chilling declaration, "You're with me now," did not feel like a rescue. It felt like a sentence. The words echoed in the stunned silence of the cathedral, but they failed to pierce the fog of her despair. Instead, they draped a new layer of cold dread over the burning humiliation. She was being passed from one owner to another, her fate decided once again without her consent. The shocked faces of the nobility, her father's slack-jawed disbelief, her mother's wide, terrified eyes, they all blurred into a meaningless tableau. She had just been publicly discarded as worthless, only to be claimed by a creature of myth whose motives were terrifyingly opaque. This was not salvation. It was a transfer of ownership, an exchange from a familiar human cage to an alien one made of shadow and starlight. And her, heart hammered with the fear of the unknown. There was no time for protest, no moment for a farewell. Kaelin's guards, clad in armor like polished obsidian, moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. They formed an impenetrable circle around her, their impassive faces cutting her off from her family and the world she knew. Her father took a hesitant step forward, his voice a choked whisper, but a single glacial look from the Elven King froze him in place. Elara felt a phantom tug on her arm, not of force, but of sheer, overwhelming presence, guiding her down the aisle. She was a ghost being led from her own funeral, her pristine white gown now a spoil of war. Every step away from the altar was a step into a deeper abyss, her agency stripped away so completely that she felt less like a person and more like a relic being carried from a fallen city. The journey was a disorienting plunge into a world of alien beauty and suffocating strangeness. The carriage she was placed in moved with an eerie silence, gliding over the cobblestones as if floating on air. Outside the enchanted glass, the familiar grimy stone of the human capital gave way to ancient whispering forests and landscapes painted in colors she had never seen. The air itself changed, growing crisp and clean, scented with night-blooming flowers and damp earth, a stark contrast to the city's stench of smoke and humanity. She was being transported not just across a border, but across the very fabric of reality. With every silent mile, the world of men with its petty cruelties and familiar pains receded, leaving her utterly alone and adrift in a sea of terrifying, ethereal splendor, a captive heading toward an unknown destination for an unimaginable purpose. Her journey ended not at a castle of stone and mortar, but in the heart of a colossal living citadel woven from ancient trees whose branches formed soaring arches against a twilight sky. Moonlight served as mortar, and bridges of silver light connected towers that pulsed with a faint living energy. Elara was led through silent, cavernous halls, her human footsteps echoing loudly in the profound quiet of immortality. She was left alone in a vast antechamber, a mortal doll in a god's home. Before her stood two massive doors of polished weirwood which swung open without a sound. A chilling, ethereal light spilled out, revealing a throne room of impossible grandeur. An elven attendant, their voice like the whisper of falling snow, simply said, "The High King awaits." She stepped forward, her heart a frantic bird in her chest, about to face the being who had claimed her, utterly terrified of why. The throne room was not a room at all, but a living cavern of silverwood and starlight, where the very air hummed with a power that vibrated deep in Ilara's bones. At its center, upon a throne carved from a single moon-white heartwood tree, sat Kalen. He was not merely a king. He was the embodiment of this ancient, terrifying world. His silver hair cascaded over shoulders clad in armor that seemed forged from solidified night, and his face was a masterpiece of lethal beauty, sharp angles and perfect lines that held no warmth, only an ageless, profound stillness. As she was forced to walk the impossibly long distance toward him, his eyes, the color of a winter sky before a storm, never left her, stripping away her defenses layer by layer. He didn't look at her as a person, but as a complex problem he was, finally about to solve, his sheer dominant aura of physical pressure. When he finally spoke, his voice was not loud, but it carried the weight of ages, a low resonance that seemed to emanate from the very stones beneath her feet. He did not ask her name or offer a single word of comfort. Instead, he spoke of his court as a battlefield. He described the Elven Council, ancient and proud beings who saw his decision to bring a mortal into their sanctum as an unforgivable act of madness, a stain upon their eternal grace. He detailed the subtle wars of attrition fought with whispers and poisoned words, the constant vigilance required to keep his ambitious rivals from exploiting any perceived weakness. "They see you as a flaw," he stated, his voice devoid of emotion, "a vulnerability to be cut away. Your very presence here is an act of war against my own kind, a gamble that has already cost me more than you can imagine." He then gestured toward a massive, living tapestry of intertwined, branches that covered the wall behind his throne. Most were vibrant with an inner light, but a creeping network of grey, brittle limbs spread through them like a disease, their leaves crumbling to dust. "This is the withering," Kaelin explained, and for the first time, a flicker of something other than cold command entered his voice, a deep, ancient weariness. "It is not a plague of the body, but a sickness of the soul. It severs our connection to the lifeblood of this world, turning our grace to rage, our light to shadow. I have watched my people, my oldest friends, fade into primal beasts. My immortality is not a gift. It is a long, slow vigil over a dying world, and I am the king of a graveyard in the making. This is my secret shame, my deepest failure." His gaze returned to her, now sharp with a terrifying purpose that made her blood run cold. "Your ancestors made pacts with the earth, weaving their life force into the fabric of this land in ways my people, for all our power, never could. They were anchors in a world of shifting tides. That magic now sleeps in your blood, a dormant seed in a barren field. The line was thought to be extinct, but I found it in you, a faint but undeniable echo of the old world." He leaned forward slightly, the movement conveying an immense controlled power. "You are not here to be a queen or a bride in the way your little lords understand it. You are here to be a key, a living conduit to reignite a power that can halt the withering and save my race from an oblivion of its own making. Your life is now forfeit to that singular purpose." He painted a picture of a ritual, a binding of essences that sounded less like a ceremony and more like a metaphysical vivisection. He spoke of her human fragility not with contempt, but with a chilling, pragmatic calculation. She was a vessel, finite and delicate, which made the process all the more dangerous and the timing all the more critical. The grand humiliation she had suffered in the cathedral, the end of her world, was now revealed to be a mere prelude to a fate far more profound and terrifying. She was no longer a pawn in a game for land and titles, but a sacrifice in a war for the very soul of a civilization. She was being asked to save a world that viewed her as less than dust, by a king who saw her as nothing more than a cure for his people's suffering. Kaelin rose from his throne, the motion fluid and absolute, erasing any lingering thought of protest from her mind. The weight of his purpose settled back over him, his brief glimpse of vulnerability vanishing behind an impenetrable mask of royal authority. He towered over her, a figure of myth casting a long, dark shadow over her mortal existence. Without another glance in her direction, he issued a command to one of the silent, obsidian-clad guards who stood like statues along the walls. His voice, once again a cold, sharp instrument of power, echoed through the vast hall, sealing her immediate fate. "Take her, prepare her for the binding. I will call for her when the moon is at its zenith." To Ilara, it was not a plan being set in motion. It was a death sentence being pronounced. Ilara was brought before him not as a guest, but as a specimen. The guards left her in the center of the vast, circular chamber, a lone, fragile figure on a floor of polished obsidian that reflected a sky of captive stars above. Kaelin did not rise. He remained on his throne of woven silverwood, a predator observing his captured prey, his stillness more intimidating than any overt threat. The air was cold, clean, and carried the scent of ancient stone and something else, something wild and green that spoke of a world untouched by human hands. He watched her for a long, silent moment, his piercing gaze dissecting her, peeling back the layers of her fear and humiliation to search for the one thing he needed. She felt less like a person and more like a lock he was examining, wondering if the key he held would finally turn. "Your former life is a memory," he began, his voice a low, resonant hum that vibrated through the floor and up into her bones. The shame your people cast upon you is less than dust to me. Forget the name Valerius. Forget the weakness of your father and the pity of your court. They are insects playing games in the dirt, and their world has no meaning here." He gestured dismissively, as if swatting away the entirety of human civilization. "You are not here because of what they did to you. You are here because of what you are. Your presence in my court is not a rescue, it is a necessity born of desperation. My desperation." The admission hung in the air, a crack in his perfect, formidable facade, far more terrifying than any threat he could have uttered. He leaned forward, the starlight from above catching the sharp, perfect planes of his face. "My court is not a sanctuary. It is a nest of ancient, prideful creatures who have watched empires rise and fall. They see your mortality as a disease, your presence as an insult to our eternal nature. My counsel whispers of my weakness, of the madness that would lead me to bring a failed human, into our sacred heartwood. They are knives in the dark, waiting for me to stumble. Your every breath here is a provocation, a challenge to my authority. If they believed for a single moment that you were anything less than my explicitly chosen consort, they would tear you apart before the next moonrise, and I would be powerless to stop them without igniting a civil war that would shatter what remains of my kingdom. But their plotting is a symptom of a deeper sickness," Kalen continued, his voice dropping, taking on a tone of profound, ageless sorrow. "A plague of the soul we call the withering. It is a slow unraveling, a fraying of the threads that bind us to the life of this world. It turns our light to shadow, our serenity to a primal, unthinking rage. I have watched friends I have known for millennia fade into snarling beasts, their immortality becoming an eternal prison of mindless fury. This is the truth of my reign. I am a king presiding over a slow, inevitable extinction." He rose from his throne, a towering silhouette against the star-dusted ceiling. "My people are dying, and you, Ilara of House Vance, are the only cure. Your bloodline carries a dormant magic, a connection to the old earth that my kind has lost. You are the anchor that can stop the decay." He stood before her now, the cold radiating from his armor, a palpable force. "Therefore, this is my proposal. It is not a request. You will become my wife. We will be bound in a ceremony that will satisfy my court and silence the whispers of my rivals. To the world, you will be the High Queen, an inexplicable but undeniable choice that will serve as a testament to my unassailable power. Your family will not be ruined. They will be elevated beyond their wildest ambitions, protected under the shadow of my name. The man who abandoned you will grovel at the very thought of you. You will trade a life of shame for a crown of starlight. You will be feared, you will be respected, and you will be utterly untouchable." The offer was a cage of impossible, breathtaking beauty, a prison forged from power and prestige. In exchange for this life, for this protection and power, her role was simple. "In private," he stated, his voice devoid of any warmth, "you will be my instrument. This marriage will be a shell, a political necessity to grant me the time and proximity I need to access the magic in your blood. I will prepare you for a ritual that will reawaken your dormant power and bind it to the heart of my kingdom, severing the hold of the withering. It will be dangerous. It may cost you dearly, but it is the only path forward. You will save my people from oblivion, and in doing so, you will secure a life of influence and security that no mortal queen has ever known. You will trade your one fleeting life for the eternal survival of a race. This is the pact I offer you. Your only choice is to accept it." A profound silence descended upon the chamber, heavier and more suffocating than the one in the cathedral. Ilara stood frozen, the sheer, audacious scale of his words washing over her. He was offering her everything she could never have: power, respect, a reversal of her deepest humiliation. But the price was her very self. She would be a vessel, a tool, a living sacrifice disguised as a queen. She looked up at him, this ancient, beautiful, terrible being who saw her not as a woman, but as a solution to an impossible problem. The fear was a living thing inside her, a cold serpent coiling in her gut. Yet beneath the terror, something else stirred. A flicker of defiance. He had told her she had no choice, but in his desperation, he had given her the one thing no one else ever had: leverage. Her voice, when it finally came, was a trembling whisper, yet it cut through the immense silence of the throne room with the shocking clarity of shattering glass. "I accept," she said, her chin lifting as she met his wintry gaze. The words hung between them, a fragile bridge over an abyss of unknown dangers. He gave a slight, almost imperceptible nod of satisfaction, a king whose calculations had proven correct. But she was not finished. A lifetime of being silent, of being a dutiful pawn, had just been incinerated at the altar, and from the ashes a new resolve was born. "I accept," she repeated, her voice gaining a sliver of strength. "On one condition: you will not treat me as your instrument. You will teach me. I will not be a key you turn in a lock. I will learn to wield this power myself. I will be your partner in this, not your sacrifice." For a long moment that stretched into an eternity, Kalen simply watched her, his expression an unreadable mask of ancient stillness. The audacity of her demand, to be a partner, not a pawn, hung in the air, a fragile yet defiant challenge to his absolute authority. Ilara's heart hammered against her ribs, convinced she had overplayed her hand, that this terrifyingly powerful being would simply crush her for her insolence. Then a subtle shift occurred in the wintry landscape of his eyes. It was not warmth, but the barest flicker of something akin to surprise, perhaps even a sliver of respect. The corner of his mouth tilted in a gesture that was not quite a smile, but a concession. "So be it," he stated, his voice a low rumble that sealed their new, treacherous pact. "You will learn, but the price of that knowledge will be your absolute obedience in all other matters. The board is set, Ilara of House Vance. Now we play." The ceremony was not an affair of human pomp and circumstance. It was a swift, silent, and deeply unsettling binding. There was no cathedral, no priest, no audience of gossiping nobles. Instead, two of his obsidian-clad guards escorted her to the heartwood of the citadel, a sacred open-air grove where ancient silverwood trees drank the starlight from the sky. Only a handful of his most senior council members were present, their faces like carved alabaster, their eyes holding the cold, judgmental weight of millennia. Kalen stood waiting for her on a dais of living roots. He took her hand, his touch cool and firm, and spoke a single binding vow in the elven tongue. The words were a song of power, weaving through the air and settling over her like a shroud of starlight and shadow, tying her fate to his with an unbreakable, magical finality. There was no turning back. News of the union spread through the mortal realms like wildfire carried on a gale. An elven emissary, silent and imposing, delivered the proclamation to her father's court, leaving a stunned silence in his wake. Her mother was seen collapsing into tears, a storm of terror and relief that her daughter was not ruined, but was instead claimed by a creature of terrifying legend. Her father, Lord Vance, was rendered, speechless, his ambition so horrifically outmatched that he could only stare at the royal elven seal, his face pale with a mixture of awe and profound fear. Lord Valerius, the man who had abandoned her, reportedly flew into a rage, his public humiliation now absolute, his name a laughingstock. He had discarded a stone, only to watch it become the most coveted and untouchable jewel in the world, forever beyond his reach. Within the elven court, the reaction was a far more subtle and venomous affair. The council members who witnessed the binding offered their king a stiff, formal bow, but their eyes were chips of ice, promising a cold war of attrition. Whispers slithered through the crystalline halls, branding Ilara the mortal blight, a symptom of the king's growing desperation and weakness. From a shadowed balcony, a powerful elven noble named Lyra, whose own ambitions for the throne were well known, watched Ilara with undisguised contempt. Lyra's beauty was as sharp and cold as a shard of glass, and her gaze was a physical weight, assessing Ilara not as a rival, but as a flaw in the king's armor, a vulnerability she would undoubtedly seek to exploit at the earliest opportunity. The court did not see a queen. They saw a target. After the stark finality of the binding, they were led to the royal chambers. The silence between them was a chasm, filled with the unspoken realities of their pact. The rooms were impossibly beautiful, carved from the living heartwood of a single, colossal tree, with a ceiling that mirrored the star-dusted night sky above. Yet the splendor offered no comfort. It was merely a more beautiful cage. Ilara was hyper-aware of Kaelin's presence beside her. He moved with a predator's silent grace, his power a palpable aura that chilled the air and made her feel small and fragile. Every instinct screamed at her to flee, but there was nowhere to go. She had willingly stepped into the lion's den, and now the door had been sealed shut behind her, the lock turned by her own desperate words. An elven attendant, a being of androgynous beauty and unnerving stillness, moved to help Ilara remove the heavy, star-embroidered cloak she wore for the ceremony. Before the attendant could touch her, Kaelin dismissed them with a curt, authoritative gesture. He stepped behind Ilara, his closeness a sudden, shocking invasion of her space. The fine hairs on her arms and the back of her neck rose as she felt the cool air displaced by his presence. His long, elegant fingers brushed against the sensitive skin of her nape as he worked the intricate silver clasp. The touch was meant to be impersonal, a simple action, yet it sent a jolt of pure, unadulterated electricity through her, a shocking and deeply unwanted spark that lit up every nerve in her body, leaving her trembling in its wake. For Kaelin, the gesture was a calculated display of possession, a silent declaration to any watching eyes that she belonged to him. Yet the reality of the contact was unexpectedly jarring. He had anticipated the feel of the cloak's fabric, the cold metal of the clasp, but not the surprising warmth of her mortal skin against his fingertips. For a fleeting, disorienting second, he felt the delicate, frantic flutter of the pulse in her throat, a visceral reminder of the fragile, fleeting life that now held the key to his entire civilization's survival. The sensation was foreign, unsettling, and it complicated his cold, pragmatic equation in a way he had not foreseen. She was not merely a vessel, she was a living, breathing creature, and that simple fact threatened to unravel the precise control upon which his long life had been built. He moved to stand before her, his hands coming to rest on her shoulders. His grip was not painful, but it was unyielding, a physical anchor grounding her in the new reality of their arrangement. His winter storm eyes bored into hers, searching for any sign of weakness or regret. "The pact is sealed," he murmured, his voice a low, resonant frequency that vibrated through her bones. "Before the court, before our enemies, you are the High Queen. Your word is second only to my own. But in this room, between us, you are the key. Do not ever confuse the two roles." The words were a deliberate dousing of the spark his touch had ignited, a cold, hard reminder of the transactional nature of their union, a necessary reinforcement of the walls between them. But the performance was not yet complete. He had to seal their public union in a way his court would understand. He lowered his head, and Ilara instinctively braced herself, expecting a cold, passionless press of lips, another calculated political maneuver. The reality was a cataclysm. His mouth claimed hers not with gentleness, but with the consuming force of a winter tempest, a raw, elemental power that was both terrifying and utterly breathtaking. There was no affection in the kiss, but there was a profound, ancient hunger, a desperate, undeniable need that resonated with the dormant magic singing in her own blood. It was not the kiss of a husband. It was the brand of a king claiming his most vital territory, a promise of something far more dangerous and consuming than a simple political accord. He broke the kiss, pulling back slowly, but the charge between them remained, a shimmering, tangible thing in the starlit air of the chamber. Her lips tingled, her lungs ached for breath she had forgotten to take, and her heart was a wild bird beating against the cage of her ribs. She looked up and saw for the first time a crack in his formidable control. In the depths of his eyes was not command or satisfaction, but a flicker of raw, unguarded astonishment, as if the sheer intensity of the connection had ambushed him as well. In that moment, he was not looking at her as a solution or a tool, but as an untamed fire he had just unleashed. The agreement was sealed, but the kiss had just irrevocably rewritten every single one of its terms, and the look on his face suggested he now feared he would be the first to be burned. The days in the elven citadel bled into a strange and silent routine. Ilara spent her hours in the colossal library, a place where books were living things, their pages whispering forgotten histories into the quiet air. She struggled with the fluid, song-like elven language, each symbol a puzzle she couldn't solve. One morning, after a particularly frustrating session, she returned to find a small, leather-bound primer on her table, its pages filled with meticulous translations of the very texts she had been studying. Kaelin was nowhere to be seen, and no one mentioned the book's appearance. It was an act of silent observation, an impersonal kindness that felt intensely, dangerously personal. It was the first time she felt seen, not as a key or a queen, but simply as a person struggling, and the gesture resonated in the hollow space of her chest more profoundly than any grand proclamation. A flicker of her old self surfaced in the royal training grounds. She picked up a human longbow, the familiar weight a comfort in her hands, and surprised the stoic elven guards with her proficiency. An arrow thudded into the heart of a distant target, and a rare, genuine smile touched her lips. Rishil, one of the younger guards, approached with an appreciative gleam in his eyes, offering a friendly suggestion on her stance. Before he could finish, the temperature of the courtyard dropped. Kaelin had appeared, silent as a shadow, his presence a palpable wave of cold authority. "Your duties do not include instructing my queen," he stated, his voice clipped and sharp. Riel bowed low and vanished. Ilara stared, bewildered by the raw, possessive edge in Kaelin's tone, a spark of something that felt unnervingly like jealousy, and it confused and unsettled her far more than his usual detached command. Her presence was formally required at the King's Council, a gathering of ancient, powerful elves whose collective age could be measured in geological epochs. She sat on a smaller yet still ornate throne beside Kaelin, feeling like a field mouse presiding over a convocation of eagles. Lord Theron, an elder with eyes like chips of granite, rose and spoke, his voice a dry rustle of ancient leaves. He never addressed her directly, but his words were barbs aimed solely at her. He spoke of the mortal distraction, the folly of binding their eternal future to a creature of fleeting seasons, his contempt a palpable force that filled the chamber. Every word was a reminder of her otherness, a public humiliation designed to underscore her illegitimacy and Kaelin's supposed weakness in choosing her. The shame was a familiar fire, burning her cheeks red in the cold, judgmental silence of the elven lords. Calen listened to the veiled insults with an unnerving stillness, his face a mask of cold indifference. When Theron finished, the king did not look at Ilara. He did not offer a comforting glance or a reassuring gesture. His gaze remained fixed on the Elder Lord, and when he spoke, his voice was not loud, but it cut through the vast chamber like the crack of a glacier. "My queen's presence on this council is not a matter for debate. It is a reality you will accept," he said, the words perfectly articulated and laced with deadly promise. "Question my judgment in this chamber again, Lord Theron, and you will find your own long and respected season has at last come to a permanent end." The threat was absolute, chilling the very air and silencing any further dissent. Ilara felt a wave of relief, quickly followed by a profound emptiness. He had defended his authority, not her honor. Later, in the starlit privacy of their chambers, the tension between them was a tangible thing. "You should not have done that," Ilara said, her voice trembling slightly. "It only gives them more reason to despise me." Calen turned on her. His usual icy control, fractured by a roar, contained fury. "I did it because their insolence threatens the stability of this court, which in turn threatens our entire purpose. Your feelings on the matter are an irrelevant luxury." The words were cruel, designed to push her away, yet he stepped closer, his imposing frame trapping her between his body and the cold stone of the balcony. The proximity was overwhelming, a magnetic force that stole the air from her lungs. In his eyes, she saw a storm of something far more volatile than cold. Calculation, a fire that both terrified her and drew her in. He was losing control, and she was the cause. He turned away from her abruptly, the spell broken, and stared out at the endless, whispering forest. The rigid line of his shoulders betrayed an immense strain. "Every whisper against you is a blade, aimed at my back," he admitted, his voice low and ragged, stripped of its royal authority. "They test my resolve, searching for the crack that will shatter my reign and doom our people." For the first time, he spoke not as a king, but as a man burdened by the slow, agonizing extinction of his race. He spoke of the faces of friends he had known for millennia, now lost to the mindless rage of the withering. In that moment of shared vulnerability, Ilara saw past the terrifying immortal to the weary, desperate ruler beneath. An unwanted and dangerous wave of empathy washed over her, a foolish, mortal desire to reach out and soothe an ancient, impossible pain. The court's animosity crystallized at a grand celestial ball, an event of breathtaking beauty and subtle cruelty. Lyra, the ambitious noble with eyes like shards of ice, cornered Ilara near a fountain of shimmering moonlight. With a smile that never reached her eyes, Lyra offered Ilara a crystal flute of iridescent wine. "It must be so tragic," she mused, her voice a silken weapon for the entire court to hear. To be a creature of such fleeting beauty, to burn so brightly, but for such a short, meaningless time, a moth drawn to an eternal flame. The words were a masterpiece of public humiliation, painting Ilara as a pathetic temporary pet, a foolish indulgence of their king. The surrounding elves watched with cold, predatory amusement, waiting to see the little mortal queen crumble under the weight of their collective scorn. Before a single choked reply could form in Ilara's throat, Calen was there, moving with the silent, lethal grace of a striking serpent. He took the wine flute from Lyra's hand, his fingers brushing hers with a touch that made her flinch as if burned. His gaze, however, was fixed on Lyra, and it burned with a cold, white-hot fire that made the formidable noblewoman pale. "My queen's life is not tragic," he said, his voice low but carrying with absolute authority to every corner of the silent ballroom. "It is the anchor that will save us all. It possesses a value your empty eternity cannot possibly comprehend." He then turned his burning gaze upon the assembled court. "Let there be no misunderstanding. Any insult offered to her is an act of treason against the crown. The consequences will be final." This was different. He had defended her. He took her hand, his grip firm and possessive, and led her from the stunned ballroom without a backward glance. The silence in their chambers was no longer a cold, empty chasm, but a space thick with the unspoken implications of his public declaration. Ilara looked down at their joined hands, the warmth of his skin a shocking contrast to his usual coldness, then slowly raised her eyes to his face. The protective fury she had seen in the ballroom had faded, replaced by a turbulent, guarded expression she couldn't decipher. The question that had been taking root in her heart for weeks finally broke the surface, her voice a fragile whisper that seemed to echo in the vast room. "Are we truly just pretending?" The words hung between them, a terrifying and beautiful challenge to the cold, hard lines of their pact. Kaelin dropped her hand, as if it were a hot coal, severing the connection instantly. He spun away, putting the vast expanse of the chamber between them, his back a rigid wall of denial. The mask of the indifferent king slammed back into place, colder and more impenetrable than ever before. "Do not mistake a necessary political maneuver for sentiment," he bit out, his voice harsh and dismissive. "Lyra challenged my authority. I merely put her back in her place. Our arrangement has not changed. You are the key, that is all." But his denial was too quick, his retreat too absolute. He refused to meet her gaze, and in that moment of avoidance, Ilara saw the truth. He was just as terrified of the fragile, burgeoning thing between them as she was. The pretense was becoming real for him too, and it was threatening to shatter his millennia of control. Their charged standoff was interrupted by the silent arrival of a royal attendant, who bowed so low their forehead nearly touched the floor. The elf carried a silver scroll, sealed with the ancient sigil of the Elven Council. With grave formality, the attendant announced the council's unanimous decree. The oldest traditions, those woven into the very magical fabric of the realm, demanded more than a simple binding ceremony. For the union to be truly recognized by the Heartwood, for the Queen's dormant magic to be accepted as an anchor against the withering, the bond must be proven. There must be a public ritual of consummation, a sacred act to demonstrate the legitimacy of their union to the ancient and unforgiving powers that governed their world. The demand was a political and personal cataclysm, aimed directly at the heart of their fragile, unspoken feelings. The attendant retreated, leaving Kaelin and Ilara alone in a silence more profound and terrifying than any that had come before. The council's ultimatum hung in the air, an inescapable mandate. The one line they had so carefully avoided crossing was now a public and magical necessity. The pretense that had been their shield was being forcibly stripped away, compelling them into a deeper, more perilous intimacy they were not prepared for. Kaelin finally turned to face her, his expression an unreadable mask of royal steel, but his eyes were a raging storm of conflict. He was trapped, cornered by the very traditions he was sworn to uphold. The transactional nature of their pact was shattered, and they were left facing a future where they would have to bare their souls to each other, a move that could either save his kingdom or utterly destroy them both. The silence that followed the attendant's departure was a living entity, a suffocating presence that pressed in on Ilara until she felt her ribs might crack. The council's decree was a death sentence for the fragile, unspoken thing that had begun to grow between them. She finally turned to face him, her hands clenched at her sides, her voice not a shout, but a low, trembling accusation that was somehow worse. "All this time," she whispered, the words catching in her throat, "you let me believe this was a performance. You let me navigate the vipers in your court. You let me stand beside you, all while knowing this was the inevitable end. Was it ever just a pact to you, or was I always meant to be the final, intimate sacrifice? Her question was not about the physical act, but about the profound emotional betrayal, the realization that he had been grooming her for a purpose he had never dared to name. Calen flinched as if struck, his regal composure shattering like a pane of ice. He paced the length of the chamber, a caged predator, the starlight from the ceiling glinting off his silver hair. "It is not that simple," he ground out, his voice raw with a frustration that bordered on despair. "The council did not just invoke tradition, they invoked the primeval law. The magic that sleeps in your blood cannot be commanded or taken. It must be given freely, anchored by a genuine resonance. If the bond between us is a lie, if there is no true emotional current when we perform the final ritual, the power will not only reject the binding, it will turn on its conduit. It will consume you from the inside out." He finally stopped, turning to face her, his eyes a maelstrom of guilt and desperation. "They have not commanded a consummation, Ilara. They have commanded a test of truth, with your life as the forfeit." The confession landed with the force of a physical blow, stealing the air from her lungs. It wasn't the threat of death that horrified her, it was the chilling, calculated deception. He had known. From the very beginning, he had known that her survival depended not on his protection or her political acumen, but on her ability to form a genuine connection with him, the very thing he had relentlessly pushed away. Every cold word, every dismissive gesture, every reminder that she was merely a key, now seemed like a cruel and deliberate act of sabotage. "So you watched me," she said, her voice hollow with dawning horror, "wondering if I would come to care for my captor enough to not die. You stood by while I fought to find my footing in this gilded cage, all the while holding the one secret that mattered. You didn't just lie to me, Calen. You gambled with my soul." "I did it to protect you," he roared, the sound echoing with millennia of contained anguish. The king was gone, and in his place was a being torn apart by an impossible conflict. He crossed the space between them in two long strides, his hands hovering in the air as if he wanted to touch her but feared he would burn. "Don't you understand? For me to feel anything for you is to paint a target on your back so large that not even I could shield you from the arrows. My enemies, the Council, Lyra, they search for one thing, a weakness. If they knew you were anything more than a political necessity, they would use you to break me, and in doing so, doom us all. I kept my distance, not to deceive you, but because the truth of what I feel is a weapon that would be used against us both. It is a fire I have been trying to smother since the moment I first touched your hand." His words were a devastating confession wrapped in a denial, an admission of love framed as a strategic liability. The raw, unguarded agony in his eyes was undeniable, a truth more powerful than any spoken vow. It broke through her anger, leaving her adrift in a sea of shared despair. He loved her, and he believed that love would be her death sentence. She looked at this ancient, powerful, terrified man and saw the terrible symmetry of their predicament. Her past had taught her that love was a weakness, a fairy tale for other people. His immortality had taught him the exact same lesson. "So what do we do?" she whispered, the question a fragile plea. "We are commanded to bare our souls to save your people, but you believe doing so will destroy us. How can I give you a truth that you are too afraid to accept yourself?" Before he could answer, the great weirwood doors to their chamber swung open silently. A high-ranking attendant stood framed in the doorway, his expression impassive, his bow deep and formal. "High King, my queen," he announced, his voice ringing with ceremony that felt utterly obscene in the wake of their raw, emotional wreckage. "The Grand Council is assembled in the Starfall Chamber. They await your presence to hear the royal proclamation regarding the fulfillment of the primeval law." The summons was an executioner's call. Their private crisis, their impossible dilemma, was over. They were being dragged from the intimacy of their broken hearts onto the public stage, where they would have to announce a future they could not agree upon, before an audience that was waiting for them to fail. They walked into the Starfall chamber not as king and queen, but as two souls being led to a tribunal. The chamber was a vast open-air rotunda, its floor a mosaic of obsidian and silver, its ceiling the true star-dusted night sky. The entire Elven Council was assembled, a silent, intimidating circle of ancient beings whose collective gaze was a physical weight, a force of judgment that promised to crush anything less than absolute truth. Lord Theron stood as their speaker, his face a mask of cold granite, while Lyra watched from his side, a predatory gleam in her eyes, sensing the kill was near. The air was thin and frigid, each breath a sharp pain in Ilara's chest. She felt Kaelin's presence beside her, a storm of contained power, but for the first time she also felt his terror, a mirror of her own. This was not a test of their pact. It was a test of their souls, and failure meant an oblivion far worse than death. Kaelin stepped forward, his regal bearing a flawless shield for the maelstrom raging within him. He prepared to deliver the carefully constructed words of statecraft, a proclamation that would satisfy tradition while revealing nothing, a masterful lie designed to protect her by once again denying her. But as he opened his mouth, Ilara placed a hand on his arm, a small, trembling gesture that held the force of an earthquake. The contact sent a jolt through him, silencing him instantly. All eyes, ancient and cold, turned to her. In that moment, she was done being protected. She was done being a key, a secret, a liability. Her life was her own to wager. She stepped forward, leaving the shelter of his shadow, and faced the council, alone, a lone mortal flame against an eternal winter, ready to speak the one truth that could either save them or burn everything to ash. "You ask for proof of our bond," Ilara began, her voice a fragile whisper that somehow carried to every corner of the silent chamber, imbued with a strength she didn't know she possessed. "You demand a ritual to test a truth you believe does not exist. You see me as a blight, a fleeting weakness in your eternal world. You are right. I am fleeting. I was born of shame and rejection, a pawn in a game I never asked to play. I was brought here as a tool, a means to an end." Her eyes found Kaelin's across the space, and she spoke now only to him, the council fading into shadows. "But in this gilded cage I found something more terrifying than any enemy. I found a glimpse of a soul, as burdened as my own. I found a king who bleeds for his people, and I found a truth I can no longer deny, even if it is the last thing I ever speak. I love him." The words shattered the ancient stillness of the chamber. A collective gasp, sharp and cold, rippled through the council. Lyra's face contorted in a mask of furious disbelief. But Kaelin only saw Ilara, her soul laid bare, offering him a truth so pure and powerful it incinerated every last shred of his millennia-old fear. He strode to her side, not as a king claiming his queen, but as a man reaching for his only anchor in an endless sea. He took her hand, lacing his fingers through hers, and turned to face the stunned council, his voice no longer a command, but a roar of pure, unadulterated devotion. "You wished for truth, my lords. Here it is. This is not a political alliance. This is not a pact born of desperation. She is not my weakness. She is the only strength I have left. My eternity was a cold, silent prison until she filled it with light. She is the heart of this kingdom, the heart of my very soul, and if you dare threaten her, you will face not a king, but a god of wrath." As his confession echoed into the starlit sky, a profound warmth began to emanate from the very floor of the chamber. The ancient primeval magic of the heartwood, dormant for centuries, answered the call of their unified souls. A soft, silver light bloomed from the center of the room, weaving through the air, wrapping around Kaelin and Ilara in a gentle, shimmering embrace. The withering, the creeping shadow that had haunted their every moment, seemed to recoil from the pure, untainted power of their bond. The council stared, awestruck, as the very essence of their world acknowledged and blessed the union they had sought to condemn. Kaelin turned to Ilara, his winter storm eyes now clear and filled with a love so vast it was humbling. He lowered his head and kissed her, not with the fire of possession, but with the profound, soul-deep tenderness of a man who had finally come home. The seasons turned, and a gentle peace settled over the elven lands, the light of the heartwood glowing with a renewed, vibrant strength. The withering receded, its shadow banished by a love that had proven more powerful than any ancient blight. In a sun-dappled glade, Kaelin watched Ilara as she rested, her head in his lap, a soft smile on her lips. His hand rested gently on the slight swell of her stomach, a silent promise of a future they had dared to claim, a new life that would be a bridge between two worlds. Her mortal life was not a fleeting tragedy, but a gift that had taught an eternal being how to truly live. They were no longer a king and his key, but two halves of a single soul, their bond the new foundation upon which a brighter world would be built. Their story was proof that even in the longest, coldest winter, love could be the sun that brings forth the spring. If their journey has moved you, please like, comment and subscribe to witness more tales of love against all odds.